Hello, and welcome to
Hello.
today's SEI webcast, Organizational Resilience in a Time of Crisis. My name is Bobbie Stempfley. I'm the director of the CERT division here at the SEI, and I'd like to thank you for attending. Today I'm joined by Matt Butkovic, one of the tech directors here. Matt, would you introduce yourself and talk about your role here at
Good
the
morning, Bobbie.
SEI?
Absolutely. So, as Bobbie said, my name is Matt Butkovic. I lead the cyber risk and resilience bodies of work here at in the CERT division. And today, Bobbie, looking forward to a discussion of a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is organizational and operational resilience.
I think near and dear to both of our hearts, so really looking forward to this conversation. We want to make this a really I plan the conversation here, but I want to include you. So feel free to put your questions in chat, and we will work hard to get to all of them over the course of the next hour. This topic of organizational and operational resilience is important in any day, but I think it's even more important in this moment of uncertainty that we're currently experiencing. These crisis efforts where you thought you'd plan for things and maybe your plans either work or don't, really bring to the forefront the fragility in a variety of things. And so it really seems timely to focus on this. And I think, Matt, I want to get us started by talking about the term organizational and operational resilience. These are really big terms, and you've really thought deeply about this. Where do people start wrapping their head around how to approach something like operational and organizational resilience?
Yeah, certainly, Bobbie. So it is a big term or a big concept, but I think we could start small with something that's relatable. So let's first examine what we mean by resilience. Resilience is the ability of an organization or a person or a system to uh, to come back from a deformative event, right? So let me use an example or a metaphor or an analogy, right? Depending on the way we couch this. So I'm assuming, Bobbie, that as a child you likely had a slinky, as did I, right? And
Several of them.
several, right? And you and I are of the age where our slinkies were metal, not plastic. And that'll become important in a second here. So we had slinkies, and if you did what I did, you took one end of the slinky, and my brother took the other end of the slinky, and we ran in opposite directions. And suddenly, we didn't have a slinky anymore. We had a bent piece of wire. It would slink no more, right? So it was never going to walk downstairs or go around corners like the commercial. Consider resilience, operational resilience, and organizational resilience in the same light, which is you want your organization or even a specific person in your personal life. You want to be able to flex and pivot and come back into shape, just like that slinky. What you don't is to exceed that operating. And once you exceed the operating limit, there's no coming back. That's when the organization can't go back into its intended form. So a few things to consider. All organizations have an outward bound. And thankfully, most of us never find that outward bound in our personal life. And most organizations don't find that outward bound uh, in the course of their business. I would argue the combination of stressors and disruptive events we're facing right now is putting people and organizations on that edge. So, a long-winded way of saying operational and organizational resilience is a set of concepts intended, designed, and delivered to ensure that you can meet your mission. That mission could be creating something, let's say you're a manufacturing organization, or the purification of water, or it could be delivering educational services if you're a university. Every organization has a mission, and that mission is underpinned by key things it delivers. And then those things, those key services, are enabled or underpinned by assets. And we can talk about that in a minute. But let me go back to you, Bobbie, and see if my explanation is holding water so far.
Yeah, I think so. I think the one question that is really important in today's world is how do you think about resilience and change at the same time? So maybe later we'll explore where those two concepts come together and where they maybe create a little bit of action. Because I think that when we're pushed to these limits, to these outer bound limits, important for leaders to help an organization not just survive, but also take advantage of how to pivot in that moment as well. And that can both be a benefit to resilience of an organization, but I think any change creates and magnifies stress, and so I can see organizational resilience being an important element there as well.
Sure, Bobby. So let me, before the thought slips away, resilience and change are interwoven, right? So to be
Very.
resilient, you must be able to contend with change and ideally anticipate change so that you're not in a reactive mode. So if we think about organizations or we think about our own lives, and I think that unfortunately the COVID crisis has made us think about our personal exposure to risk in a way that many of us would typically avoid or kind of table that thinking. But if you think about the decisions we're making now about interacting with groups of people or visiting certain locations that might be of higher risk, we are managing our exposure to a specific type of threat, and that threat is the virus. The same goes for organizations in cyberspace and in the physical world. So when we think about operational and organizational resilience, we have an obligation to manage the conditions we expose ourselves to, right? So deciding not to go to a crowded theater and then managing the consequences. If I go to that crowded theater and I may be ill, how do I deal with that outcome? So the same applies for organizations, managing conditions and managing consequences. We all know you can't comprehensively protect yourself from all threats, therefore you can't mitigate all risk. But you have to make risk-informed decisions and allow that portion of risk that you experience to stay within your risk attitude, tolerance, and threshold.
So let's this risk tolerance and threshold concept a little bit, because I think the first thing we should do is tease apart the differences between risk threshold and sort of a tolerance activity, because I think that's a really important distinction. So, how does an organization think about risk and its areas of risk and its tolerance for assuming?
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. I think it's really important to parse it the way you described. So, an organization has a finite appetite to do things that might endanger the organization, right? And the same for individuals as we were exploring. So you have that specific limit, and that's the threshold. And if you exceed that threshold, you're now engaged in activities that are represent a risk greater than your appetite, right? So these are things that should be avoided, or if they can't be avoided, they should be well understood and the effects mitigated, right? And then there's a
Mhm.
population of things that fall below that threshold that are within your appetite range. They're within your tolerance is probably the best way to describe that. So you have to consider each of these on their own and in combination. And I think this is an important element of today's discussion, which is it's entitled right operational resilience, organizational resilience in a time of uncertainty, in a time of COVID. In essence, I'm increasingly worried about those combinations of threats. So, and I know Bobby, you've got some thoughts on this as well. We're in a situation where your workforce is disrupted physically because of the pandemic, but thankfully, we haven't seen the waves of cyber disruption that we may have anticipated, but that doesn't mean they won't happen. So I have a question for you as a follow-on there, but I just want to
Yes.
put this idea on the table, which is organizations can't think about these risk categories in isolation. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? To do risk management well, to ensure that you're not exceeding that threshold, to make sure you're staying within the risk tolerance parameters, you have to think about the interplay of physical and digital, right? And from a resilience perspective, that means thinking about four basic asset types: people, facilities, information, and technology. And if we think about that list, the current crisis or set of crises we're dealing with are disrupting multiple assets at the same time. But the cyber, or the information and the technology asset, those have been largely unimpaired by the events of the day. My worry is that you could then see an amplification of crisis by a large scale cyber event disrupting those assets in addition to the others. rendering even more difficult the task of meeting your mission. So, Bobbie, I know you've had a variety of roles where you had to think about assets and think about mission. Um, I think it's safe to say that as cybersecurity practitioners, we've become really used to giving sort of a pat answer on how you look at cyber risk, right? We've gotten good at analyzing the relative likelihood and impact of those cyber risk. I would argue, and I wanted your thoughts on this, I think that cybersecurity practitioners struggle at times to join what we know in our discipline with the folks that focus on physical risk and physical security. And this pandemic and the loss or the impairment of facilities has had us thinking about those things in a way that probably wasn't front of mind a year ago for most folks working in cyber.
Yeah, I think you're right. Although I think there are places where we need to be more precise. And that is if you look at the global digital enterprise, you're right, it has been shockingly resilient, to use that word, in this pivot that everybody has happened. But I don't think everyone has experienced equally the cyber risks that have occurred here. And so I do think there is an uptick in some malicious activity that's going on, and I think we should be really careful not to broad brush in that activity, because any kind of crisis, it creates even more stress on those least prepared to handle the crisis, which tend to be those that have prepared the least, or who have the limited amount of resources to adapt in this situation. And I think this one as well, against those four asset classes, has done the same thing. Everybody has assumed a particular operating model, whether it be in a facility or leveraging a facility. They've built their supply chains to operate in a particular manner, and we've now perturbated those, and it's taken a little while for them to come back. I like the generality of those four asset classes, right? Humans and facilities, technology and information, because that lets you draw it back to the common language across cybersecurity, physical security, business continuity, and others. And that is the business or the mission of the organization. And you can really, if you start there, then you do have that common language across all of the different individuals. And as cybersecurity practitioners, we have had a history of getting very detailed very quickly about what's going on in the tech, and we need to make sure that we can have an effective communication about how that impacts the business or the mission. And I think that's why so much of this idea of organizational resilience and operational resilience has to start at that level, right? How much risk will you accept to the business or to the mission? And in some areas, it's none or a very small amount. And in other areas, it can be a large amount. And so that idea of differentiation, I think, becomes really important and speaks to the need to have preparation and practices in place.
Yeah,
So
Bobbie.
how do you, please,
Sorry.
Matt.
No,
Yep.
I'm sorry, Bobbie. I was just eager to build on your point and reinforce it. So it may seem reductive to talk about only four asset types and key services, but there's a power in that you've described, which is, if you can boil it down, it makes it easier not only to kind of understand the interplay between your critical services, your mission, and your assets, but it allows you to take substantive action in a way that's much more productive. So if I said we're going to change a bunch of stuff in a generalized way that affects technology assets, it's kind of hard to measure how much you've done and what the impact is. I would argue that to make fundamental changes in the way we protect and sustain assets, right, be it the data center or specific parts of the technology stack or people, we need to action those things at an asset level. So just kind of reinforcing the point that for those maybe unfamiliar with the way that we look at operational and organizational resilience at the SCI, there's a specific logic as to why we assign and group assets in those four categories, and why the list may not be as expansive as you might assume, because we do see a power in being able to boil it down and reduce to the fundamentals, right? And I think that something that the current crisis is teaching us is that mastering the fundamentals really matters. So one of the ways in which I think the COVID crisis and cyber are similar is that both affect multiple geographical locations simultaneously without regard for border, right? So if you think about natural disaster, going back to that description of maybe physical security not being front of mind for cybersecurity practitioners, it's unlikely for organizations that have any geographic disparity that a single event is going to simultaneously affect all of their locations, right? Globally. That happens in cyber and it's happening with COVID. And I think it's interesting to see the way that the two communities are now seeing kind of mutual understanding of why it matters, why you have to prepare for that scenario, right? So just wanted to not engage in a ramble, but I wanted to just kind of reinforce the point that understanding your operational and organizational resilience at the asset level is very important. And I would argue that the current crisis is teaching us lessons or reinforcing lessons about how comparable a threat can be both in the physical world and in the cyber world.
Yeah, so I think two things are important. One is those four asset classes are the top level, right? You devolve within those
Correct.
down to more detail. So it isn't about simplifying it to the point of making the problem seem less important or less complex than it is, but it is about giving you a common language. I also think it's important. We have a question about thinking about the new normal, right? When we think about how we build and sustain our resilience programs in organizations, how then you bring in the lessons and you say, okay, now I want my new normal to be more of a remote workforce, perhaps, or more of a change of my technical architecture. So I put this new technical architecture in place to support the operating model that's today. That's now my new normal. How do I bring that back into my organizational business continuity and resilient functions? So you've done several, helped people go through the establishment of their programs. You've done some of these yourself. Perhaps you can give us some lessons
Yeah, certainly, Bobbie.
from
So I'll
your
draw.
experience.
Yeah, thanks, Bobbie. So I'll draw my experience both at the SEI and then when I was in private industry. But a thought first, if I may, about the new normal. So I think maybe we should scrap the idea of a new normal, right? Certainly, we have a new way of working or a modified way of working, but I think that looking at these as normal and abnormal or standard and non-standard is probably not counterproductive in the long run for us. So and I know that's not your term, Bobbie. It's a term that we're all using these days. But I was thinking about this last night. So I think it's more productive to think about modes of operation. So the immediate new normal is your workforce is highly decentralized, working from home, depending on infrastructure not owned by the organization primarily, which is fraught with new risk. Do I think this will be the way of working forever? No. I think we're going to come back to some middle ground where we have a larger, more robust remote workforce, a work from home force in most organizations. But certainly, we're still going to have offices and we're still going to have data centers, and all those things are still going to be there. So I think we're in this sort of early honeymoon phase of the new normal. So, with all that said, organizations need to think about that mixed mode. It's not just standard operations and disaster recovery, it's now this perpetual blended hybrid mode where a certain percentage of your workforce will need to toggle on the ability to work from anywhere in a comparably secured manner perpetually, right? So, the really good news is, I mean, think about what we're doing today, right? You're in Virginia, I'm in Pennsylvania, and we're having this webcast global. And we did this with relative elegance, right? Using the equipment I took home when I left the office on March 12th of this year. So the technology's caught up in a way that allows us to do business continuity and process continuity in a way that was very difficult before we had ubiquitous broadband and before we had virtualization of systems and applications like Zoom and Skype. So you asked about lessons learned. One of the chief lessons that I learned doing business impact assessments in private industry and working with organizations at the SEI is that there's a temptation to focus on the movie plot stuff. And what I mean by that, I think a very specific example was in manufacturing. Um, I remember executives being very excited to buy satellite phones and solar blankets and talking about, right, EMP attacks. And my question was, well, what happens if this factory in the Midwest burns down? So I think to kind of build on the theme, Bobbie, start in a way that's digestible and focus on a set of things that you can get your head around. And that's where the four asset types come back, right? It's not that we're stopping at saying information, technology, people, and facilities, but rather those are categories. And those categories are then matrix. So let's say in my past life, I worked for a manufacturer organization. And at the time in North America, we had something like 1,100 products, right? That database server and that production control equipment wasn't used exclusively for one of those, but rather across that stack. So I think, again, anticipating some disruption in your operation requires you to think then about the assets that comprise that operation. Another pitfall that I've seen is a focus not only on sort of the movie plot stuff, the comet hits the factory or zombie apocalypse, but rather a lack of focus on return to work, and that was, I think, the second part of the question you're asking. So once you go into a non-standard mode of operation, and I think we should probably draw a distinction between the work from home situation we're in now and a true loss of data center or loss of production facility, which then invokes alternate resources in a much more substantial way. But once you're using those alternate resources, once you've gone from the primary data center to the alternate data center, for lots of reasons, both operational and financial, you need a plan to go back. You can't stay in that mode forever. And I saw lots of organizations, and my own at the time, right, and we corrected this, was focused on going to the DR site, invoking the business continuity plan, with very little thinking about resumption of standard operations. So I think COVID is a variation on a theme. As I mentioned, essentially we're dealing with a distributed workforce in a way that's new and novel at a scale that's new and novel, but they're still doing the same things basically with technology that we had in hand, which is different than oh my, right? The data center caught fire and now we need to cut over to the alternate site where our throughput's different, it's potentially different staff, remote administration looks different. We're not journaling certain transactions in our production systems. All of those nuances need to be thought through because without that, it's difficult to ever return to normal operations. I'll just share a quick story about that. Did a business impact assessment for an organization in the UK, and they'd recently moved from one enterprise resource planning system to another. And the new enterprise resource planning system was state of the art to the point where no one knew how to then restore transactions that were performed while the system was offline. So basically the answer was, if something bad happens to SAP, stop the factory because we can never get the information back into SAP. And it's those sorts of gotchas with information and technology that organizations need to think through. There's I describe it as the "we've got good people" fallacy. It doesn't mean you don't have good people, right? You have lots of good people, but the idea is, right, something bad happens, the system breaks. We don't need a DR plan. Disaster recovery will take care of itself because we've got good people. It doesn't matter how earnest and skilled your people are. If they don't have the tools to perform their job, you're going to be in a difficult situation. So the idea that SAP goes down, but the Dunkirk spirit takes over and we're all going to pull together, that works on a human sort of emotional level, but the technical reality is that you don't have the form stock, you don't have the basic raw materials needed, right, to capture transactions or perform those tasks. So my advice is stay realistic and absolutely engage in tabletop exercises, right? Make them realistic, have them span from things as simple as we've had a fire in a key facility through we have a global pandemic, right? I think that understanding that spectrum of disruptive events is really important because the impact and the way you resume your normal operations are quite different.
So I go back to the four asset classes, and the first one we talked about was people, right? Your people have to be resilient in their own right, which means you have to have systems and infrastructure to enable them and support them throughout the effort. And then you have to also have facilities and technology and information that support your business operations as a part of it. And I think that's a really powerful way. And I like the fact that we start with that piece, that sort of people element of it, because I think that's important. The other one that I find interesting and I want to explore for a few minutes is we've talked a lot about needing to do planning, everything from, you have to have meaningful architectures in place. Had this pandemic hit 10 years ago, before we had these tools, I think we'd have a very different experience and sort of a different model because of all of the advances in technology, in virtualization, and in wide-scale broadband capability. We have a greater capacity today. It's not equal, right? There are different parts of the country, different parts of the world that have this and don't have it. And I think that's an important thing for us to address from a resilience concept as well. But I also think, let's talk a little bit about how an organization that started out making a risk decision, taking on perhaps more technical risk, more infrastructure and information risk in order to sustain operations throughout this time period, and is now backstopping that with advanced technology, with supporting their people and perhaps more or fewer people depending on their business. How do they go back and shore up that additional risk that they took because this is going to last a sort of a much longer period of time?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think probably an underexplored topic, Bobbie, which is what you're describing in part is now questioning the viability of the lifeboat, right, or the strength of the parachute. So we've survived the immediate crisis. We're now in this mode. The longer this goes on, is there an increased risk that the lifeboat starts taking on water? Is there an increased chance that the very safeguards that have seen us through are going to erode over time? And there's a familiar concept for cybersecurity practitioners, which is that we're going to fail safe, right? We're going to ensure that our systems fail safe. But when you're working in this alternate mode, things often also fail open. So you are taking on additional risk potentially. And I think you're right. The advancements in technology have made this easier. But the truth is, there are procedures and controls that you would execute in normal operation that you're probably foregoing in this way of working, right? I think about additional levels of log review as a simple example, or ensuring that you have periodic maintenance activities executed. So, for instance, a number of organizations will delay patching, right, of systems and platforms when they're in this mode. Well, that's fine in the short term, but eventually you're going to need to do that because the trade-off is you've become less secure because you potentially have this unpatched vulnerability. But again, these are all risk decisions. So I think your point's a really good one, which is it's not only ensuring the viability of your alternate way of working, but then understanding the limits of that way of working. When do you become less secure in a way that makes systems untrustworthy, right? So I think that lots of organizations are sort of making up as they go along because they have to. We're all sort of in that mode. Even the best pandemic planning efforts that I've seen did not foresee a pandemic of this duration, right? So I'll share with you that I was part of a pandemic planning committee in private industry for SARS and the avian flu, and the time horizon for that was much shorter. Now there was a greater expected loss of life, so in some ways it was more dire, but we thought the duration would be shorter. What we're seeing is a tragic loss of life in an extended, slower build in a way that I think lots of plans didn't account for. So, with that said, not to sort of touch on something a bit morose, but organizations have to assume that some of their staff will be incapacitated. Hopefully not. Hopefully don't lose their lives in the pandemic, but certainly you have to plan for the loss of key personnel. One of the things that I saw in the pandemic planning exercises I was a part of is that there's a lot of optimism, right? The truth is, if someone's family is in dire need of medical attention and someone's loved ones are ill, I think it's overly optimistic to assume that the network administrator is going to be willing and in the right frame of mind to perform their job in the way they did before that pandemic. So you've got to look for alternate resources and temper expectations on what folks are willing to endure in support of their employer.
So let's take this idea of business continuity and this kind of planning on a continuum. That it isn't okay. Today we're here and we're going to plan for a crisis, and then we're going to plan to make a full step back into normal operation. That we're on this sort of long-term continuum effort. What do you think might be the best practices for continued evaluation of your organizational resilience practices? I mean, I see ICS as a cybersecurity community, and different organizations really focusing on communicating with their people, keeping in touch with them, understanding what their supply chains are, and really in some instances now understanding what their supply chains are and who the suppliers to suppliers are. But at what point in your planning do you go back and put in place the processes you'd historically had to think about risks and to evaluate them and to incorporate them in your current and future decision making?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bobbie. I think that we need to look at that as an iterative cycle. So I would argue that organizations have several months of COVID contingency to consider. So it needs to be an iterative process. Your disaster recovery and business continuity plans or continuity operations plans, those need to be sort of perpetually reconsidered. The worst thing you can do, well, the worst thing you can do is not consider this at all, right? That
Right.
you right, thinking that being lucky is better than being good, right? That's a problem. Um, the second worst thing that you can do is fighting the last war, and I see a lot of that with business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. So we're dealing with the COVID crisis. We all hope this is a once in a century type event, but the truth is we could see a variation on a theme, right? Something else could happen that looks very much like this, but not exactly like it. So I think that the best advice we can offer is for organizations to make that list of potential scenarios that are worth considering in their context, fact checking those and making sure they're realistic. Again, not the movie plot stuff, not the robots are coming to attack the headquarters, but rather what happens if there's a loss of electrical power or there is a new flu that creates a massive workforce outage, right? So it's something that is less significant than COVID, but more significant than disruption. Create that list. Make sure that list is considered in the context of all of the types of risks that you face, right? So one of the things that that I'll point to within Carnegie Mellon, where we address this, is the Chief Risk Officer program, CRO program, Certificate Executive Program, where one of the things that I always need to remind myself when I'm presenting on cyber risk is that cyber risk is only one of a universe of risk that organizations have to consider. So there could also be a temptation in the future to, based on our experience with COVID, and COVID will pass, right? We will resolve this, to focus myopically on physical threats related to health in a way that then will blur your vision when it comes to cyber risk. I mean, there's nothing to say that during the COVID outbreak, to your point, Bobbie, we don't see a spike in cyber attacks that are disruptive in ways we hadn't anticipated, right? So I think it's inventory and cataloging the list of risk that matter to your organization, uh, enumerating the threat actors that are most likely, and then doing the basic math that allows you to prioritize, right? At the end of the day, this comes down to prioritizing a finite set of risk and a finite set of resources to contend with those risks. So I have a question for you, Bobbie. If my answer was sufficient and I can ask you a question, I'd like to now.
Go for it.
So I'm thinking about your role and your roles in the past and sort of the view from senior leadership. So um, let's assume that we are making widgets and you are the CEO of the organization and I am the director of information security. What question would you want me to answer regarding operational resilience in the time of the COVID pandemic? What's sort of front of mind for you when you look at the essential instruments in front of you? How do you find comfort? What is, if there is one question or a set of questions, what is the most fundamental something I can answer for you to give you confidence in our ability to sustain our mission?
Yeah, so it's a really great question, and I think the first thing that becomes really important in that one is to say, uh, as the security manager, what do you see being the most different in operating in this model, right? All of the things, let's presume we understood what we needed in order to execute, in order to deliver those widgets on whatever the sort of timescale is. I would want to know what you thought was profoundly different and why. And I think that's sort of an important grounding conversation to start with, and then we can start decomposing that why, because I think that's really important, because there are lots of things to be perhaps worried about there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Which is you want to understand sort of the net difference and then drill into things we can do to affect that. Um, as we know, there's a long tail to these things. So I think that
Right.
the lessons of the current pandemic will play out. And again, I'll caution us to take those lessons in relation to things we already know. So I can already see, right, the headline in the IT and cybersecurity publications, right, that says spending on cybersecurity down, spending on physical protection up, right, and some sort of panic ensuing. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. We'll
Yeah,
find you, right?
I think you're right, but I think the real question that we've got to come to grips with is how we meaningfully quantify the spending that needs to happen on the total set of risks. And then how, as cyber, we can take advantage of some of the spending that occurs in other areas. Because this idea that physical risk is dramatically separate from cyber risk is really interesting, but in practice, your physical security measures generally are implemented via some sort of technology, and so you're equally complicating your cyber risk environment. And so we've got to find ways to capitalize on each other's programs in order to be successful
Yeah,
in these situations.
that convergence is really important, and I think there's this sort of well-traveled narrative that says, well, it's different for cyber because likelihood's harder for us to calculate, right? Well, yes and no, right? So when you talk to folks that insure risk, they'll point to an entire canon of literature and techniques for determining the the intrinsic risk of things that have limited data, right? So I think one of the things we can learn as cybersecurity practitioners in this is that these sort of events, the COVID crisis, which may seem like sort of a black swan event, these things really do occur, and they're going to cut across our asset types and cut across our risk management techniques. So the idea that I'm really trying to convey here is that the idea that cyber is distinct and different and unmanageable because we don't have the data is kind of the wrong way to look at it, right? What we need to do is aspire to gather the data that we need, to your point, to then make rigorous calculations on what works and doesn't work. What's the return on investment for physical protection in the same vein as what is the return on investment for cyber protection? And we're not there yet as an industry. And that's what keeps it exciting for us, right? Because we do have these opportunities to develop new techniques and management and measurement methods that allow us to better answer those questions.
Yeah, I think the challenge that we have is is one of speed and of understanding. And that is, I remember a national level exercise that I had the opportunity to be a part of, and trying to respond to outcomes associated with this sort of national level cyber exercise here. And it's where there were physical consequences of a cyber event. And we see that today, but when we ran that exercise, so it was probably close to 10 years ago, it was sort of new to everybody's psyche in that space. And so to explain that, to respond to reduce the physical consequences in geographic location 1, we actually had to take action in a geographic location that was 1,000 miles away. That was a really difficult concept for folks to grasp. Now, today we don't have that. People can grasp that philosophically. But what we're missing in some instances today is an appreciation for risk managers more broadly about what the particular possibilities of cyber might be, so that they can add that to their planning exercise. And so really having that, folks understand things that, like fires and physical disasters, or maybe labor disputes or something of that sort, because they've happened. And we need to continue to put in place these cyber scenarios, tabletop exercises and other things, so they can understand the cyber consequences that might occur. And more importantly, so they can understand the complexity that'll come from these things happening at the same time or at similar times. Because I think that's the other piece that we've really got to get more mature about. The second problem we have is speed, and that is that our ability to collect the data to make these kinds of decisions in a repeatable way is predicated on our having not just the opportunity to collect it, but enough data to really represent an appropriate measurement and implementation. And as threat actors change and as risks evolve so quickly, sometimes that impedes our ability to get that kind of insight. And then to create the analogy or the framing, so that you can have a management conversation, a leadership conversation about the people, the facilities, the technology, and the information necessary to execute your business.
Yeah, Bobbie, I think it's a great point that we're striving for measures that are predictive, right? So
Right.
there's a good bit of arguing over how many angels fit on the head of a pin sort of stuff in cybersecurity, and I think that's largely counterproductive, right? So to kind of join the concepts you were explaining there for the audience, focusing on consequence, so kind of consequence side calculation, and then not worrying about the fine-grained details of the threat actor, but rather the impact of the realized risk, I think is the path we need to pursue, because that'll give us impact measures that are really important in a way that I would argue are somewhat lacking now. So, yeah, likelihood's going to be thorny for us forever, right? I mean, it's just the nature of cyber, but it shouldn't be an excuse. Cybersecurity practitioners, we need to think beyond that, and then augment or compensate for any uncertainty around likelihood, right? With then drawing up on, well, what's the consequence? One of the things that I'd like to see more of is a focus on things like assurance cases and safety cases in cyber, not just for physical cyber systems, but sort of used broadly. So I think this is a technique from the safety engineering community that many cybersecurity practitioners haven't heard of, right? It's something that's just not part of the kind of generally understood body of knowledge. So I think and that's an extreme example of consequence side calculations, right? Which is we have this power plant. The power plant has nuclear materials. If it melts down, it's going to do X. We can't have X happen. So then how do we build these dependent nodes and say, here are the things that can't happen to ensure that doesn't happen, right? I think applying a little more of that logic to our discipline would be helpful.
So let's explore that for a minute. If I think about the ways that business continuity planning can go wrong, right? How you think you might have a continuity plan and not, or perhaps you haven't started one. How would you bring this idea of an assurance case into an organization's business continuity planning activity?
Yeah, certainly, Bobby. So I think it comes back again to the fundamentals. So this is where concepts like recovery time objective, recovery point objective, what maximum tolerable downtime, these things are universal, right? So it doesn't matter if the disruption is physical or rooted in some cyber exploit. These are the measures that matter. So I would say that if you're contemplating a business continuity plan, first of all, understand a business continuity plan is the superset of some things, and then disaster recovery plans are the subset of some things that address specific platforms and technologies, right? That's kind of one of the first distinctions that we all have to agree to. And then it really is gaming at if we are, it doesn't matter what you do. You could be a university, a manufacturer, a pizza shop, right? If something happens that disrupts operations, what's the maximum tolerable time you can be in that mode before reaching that outward limit that we started the conversation with, before you exceed your operational and organizational resilience? It really starts there, because at the end of the day, that's what matters, right? um, Organizations exist for a specific function, and all of the things we described, they aren't just kind of loosely affiliated things. They all work in conjunction to meet that end. So understanding your mission and then the tolerable disruption that you can endure is really important. And it doesn't have to be complicated or expensive. You can do this on a dry erase board in Excel. I suppose you could do in the back of a piece of paper if you needed to. That's one of the things that I want to make sure we reinforce in all of this, which is if you want to think, and you should, about operational and organizational resilience, it doesn't take developing an elaborate strategy. It's as simple as understanding what you do, the things you use to do it, and then thinking about the scenarios that could disrupt those operations. So start small. Um, do this in manageable bites, and learn from the process, right, to make it better. So each time you do it, there's a lower overhead associated with it. And there's lots of free tools out there. Many of those, right? I'm sure that we'll have links at the end of this presentation to the work here at CERT and the SEI broadly. But certainly there are a tremendous catalog of free resources if you want to think about contingency planning and disaster recovery planning in the larger context of operational resilience.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that idea of operational resilience. It strikes me that a small business or sort of even a micro business, this might seem unreachable. It might seem too difficult to start. But when you break it down to what business are you in, that can be a clear starting point. That's a part of it. How would you, beyond that, what's sort of step two? What are the processes that you need to put in place to go through that questioning? What business am I in? What do I need to do to accomplish the business? How long can I function without a failure of some sort? Who are providing those pieces? Do you need a lot of people? Is this something that you can do just the lead individual? How would you approach that?
Sure. I mean, there are many techniques, and of course, we have several that we've authored at the SEI and perform in collaboration with our partners in the federal government. But I would say it start really simply. So, what is it that produces revenue for the organization? What is it that you deliver to the community? What is it that that at the end of the day you would describe your organization as fundamentally doing? Start there, right? So for a micro business, say we're a micro business that sews objects and sells them on Etsy, right? As an example. What do? Well, we create these products and we sell them on Etsy, right? So what's required to do that? Well, we have the raw materials. We have the ability to then create these objects using sewing. So there's some people involved, and then there's the e-commerce part where we take this and then monetize our creations on Etsy, right? We sell them to the public. Okay. Well, that requires us then to manage a small inventory. So we're using Excel for that, right? So in that conversation, I think we've already fleshed out the pieces parts I would use to have the broader conversation, right? And I know that's kind of a very basic example, but truly, right? We've done this sort of analysis for some of the largest banks in the world and some of the smallest water departments in the U.S. By way of example, and the logic's the same, which is what is it you do? Break those things down into categories, then talk about the assets required for those categories of operations, and then start exploring these requirements, right? The protection sustainment requirements. When you start addressing protection and sustainment requirements for assets, then you quickly move to discussion of the CIA triad that we know from cybersecurity, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And sticking those fundamentals, you'll develop a list of the things that are most important and the things that you're doing now to protect and sustain, and things in the future that you probably should consider doing to protect and sustain.
And then we put them under crisis, right?
Yes.
Because that's put them under additional stress, because that's the other piece, that idea of identifying your assets and prioritizing the protection and sustainment of them is important, but then ensuring that you're doing that in a way that helps you prepare for the next stressor, not just enables you to think about what you would do in in sort of a stressful situation. I think that becomes important when we think about organizational resilience, is how to shore up beforehand.
Yeah, thank you. That's
There
a
as
key
well.
distinction. Yeah, this is why capability maturities models matter, right? Because they're predictive. We don't want to know just what you're doing today, kind of in a checklist mode, but what are those indicators of process and practice institutionalization that allow you to survive disruptive events? We won't know the total population of disruptive events, right? There's a universe of things that could happen, and lots of them we can't anticipate or even game out in a setting like this. But if you understand the fundamental resilience of your operations and assets, then the specific nature of that threat is less important. So again, the more you know about institutionalization of practice and process, the more predictive it is, because things that are institutionalized or acculturated, inculcated, right, to use a bunch of terms we like to use in the academic setting, the more survivable those things are. If there's something important that we do in our Etsy enterprise and only Bobbie knows it, and then Bobbie is unavailable, she's incapacitated for some reason, or the information's unavailable because we lost the spreadsheet, well, right, we know then that we're unlikely to then meet our mission, we're unlikely to continue that operation. And that base example then plays through clearing and settlement for the national financial infrastructure. It's the same logic, which is, what are those things that are most important? What are the variables that affect them? What does it look like when they're impaired? And you just go through those calculations, understanding what the output will be. That allows you to then tune and find harmonization of practices and processes, so that over time, if you apply this resilience mindset, resilience engineering way of working, you're finding efficiencies. You're finding maximum coverage for the controls and the practices, so you're not doing things as a one-off. So if you do these things in combination, you're left with a better ability to predict, you're doing them more efficiently, and you can worry a little less about the specific nature of the threat, because you're contending with and preparing for a wider spectrum of threat actors.
Yeah. So let's, I think we got time for one last question, and let's take this to the other extreme. So we're no longer, a single micro business making something and selling it on Etsy, which has a non-trivial supply chain as well, right? You need a supply chain for the raw materials. You need the distribution mechanism through the Postal Service or UPS or something. Now let's think about this in terms of a large organization that's a part of a regional, that's critical infrastructure in a region, or heavily interconnected with a sort of a deep supply chain concern that's there. I can see how all of these things would scale and be applied and executed. But then how do you think about doing that with your partners? Because one part of I think organizational resilience, and I think buried in the information and the people elements of assets, are who our partners might be that enable us to execute whatever that sort of important mission is.
Yeah, that is absolutely an essential point to make, Bobbie, which is your external dependencies, as we call them, right?
Right.
Your reliance on those organizations and assets that are outside of your direct control is absolutely imperative. And this is getting more complex all the time, right? So you'd be hard pressed to find an organization that doesn't use the cloud in some way, as an example. So I think the lines are blurring between assets you operate and assets someone else operates, right? In a functional sense, right? The cloud storage I rely on is seamless to me by design, but the way it's managed and the way it's secured is not seamless because I don't do it, right? So to your point, Bobbie, you have to think about this extrapolation of your requirements, the extrapolation of your needs as they're applied then to the third parties on which you rely. We have a body of work in external dependency management, supply chain management at the SCI that attempts to address this. So it's an excellent point. You can't look at this in isolation. You also can't just assume it's only the supply chain, meaning raw materials and shipping of finished goods. Think about the public services you depend on: potable water, natural gas, electrical power, roads that reliably allow you to do conveyance between two places. These are all types of external dependencies. So I think your point's a really good one, which is we have to think expansively about this, but that doesn't mean kind of confusing ourselves. We should start small and then let that radiate out, right? Here are the things we do. Here are the people we touch that do them that aren't under our direct control, and then look at that comprehensively.
Right. And so, I think there's this tension between preparing and, really thinking about preparing and responding in a crisis. And so I think, when I think about resilience, we have a question about which of those ways is more effective, and I think in my experience, any kind of crisis management and success in crisis management is largely dependent upon how well you've prepared. And perhaps you didn't prepare for the exact terms of this crisis, but you are prepared for a set of things, you're practiced at a set of things, and you can then rely upon them in a crisis situation. And when I think about emergent resilience as a sort of planned and emergent property, it really only can emerge if you've done the basics, if you've sort of done the legwork. We have about I think a minute left here, and I just want to give you the chance to make any last comments, Matt, that you didn't get a chance to share.
Well, two comments, Bobbie. First is
Please.
to the topic that you were exploring. It's not an either. It's a both, right? You have to
Absolutely.
both plan and also you have to plan for contingency, but also then ensure that you've addressed kind of standard controls. So don't look at it as an either or. And I just wanted to thank you, Bobbie, for the opportunity this afternoon to talk about these things. We're living extraordinary times. I truly believe that the folks that are watching this and our profession should take solace in the fact that the fundamentals are seeing us through. We can't take our eyes off the objective of ensuring that our organizations and our systems are resilient, and look forward to future dialogue on the topic.
I think that's really important to recognize, right? We are successful in as much as we are today because we have focused on building relationships between practitioners, building relationships inside organizations, and really help to focus on those four key asset types, right? That people, facilities, technology, and information. And I think that's really an important element. How we evolve in this world across that spectrum of, what is the crisis and execute, I think will largely depend on how much we rely on and mature our processes and our linkages between the business outcomes and those things that support that business outcomes. And so I really look forward to that. I think this is an important discussion and one that will continue on over the course of the weeks and months ahead. I also want to thank everyone for attending today. These webcasts are a great deal of fun and hope you get a lot out of them. I really hope you get to join us for our next webcast, which is the 15th of July, and its topic will be getting insight, not just oversight, into the progress of contractors using Agile. And Suze Miller will be that webcast host. Everybody that attends will be emailed the registration link, and thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you.